Datar, arranged by Public Concern for Governance Trust in collaboration with WASE Model United Nations Conference, Legal Aid Committee, and NSS unit of Government Law College. Public Concern for Governance Trust was founded by late Mr. B.G. Deshmukh, Mr. Julio Ropero, and Dr. R.K. Anand. The trust aims in increasing public participation and activism towards creating a more transparent and efficient governance system. WASE Model United Nations was founded in 2017. Ever since, the college has been arranging the conference. The conference is arranged by the college students between the age group of 12 to 21 who believe that the process of learning and gaining education and knowledge is an endless process. The Legal Aid Committee of Government Law College strives in providing legal assistance to those who cannot afford it. The Legal Aid Committee strives in four avenues: legal aid awareness cell, the legal assistance cell, the juvenile home visits, and jail visits. National Service Scheme was a program founded by the government in the year 1996. The program was started to develop overall personalities of students and youth with the motive of education through community service. Ever since, all the NSS units, including the Government Law College National Service Scheme unit, are working towards the same and believe in not me but you. For today's astounding webinar, we have Mr. Neil Dasaroy and also respected trustee of Public Concern for Governance Trust, Mr. Raja, Mr. VP Raja. I would like to request Mr. Raja to say a few words.
It's a pleasure to be here today to hear about what needs to be done in the education policy, particularly with reference to the new education policy which has been announced by the government. PCGT has been incessantly working towards helping bring transparency and openness in governance, and also point out wherever we see instances of what can broadly be called as misgovernance. We are keen to continuously contain corruption and also fight the very evils in Indian society, the evils of communalism, corruption. And in this, one of our effort is to encourage, enthuse, and motivate the youngsters, both in schools and colleges. And it is part of that college program through campus ambassadors that today's session has also been arranged, along with the help of various organizations with which PCGT has had a long relationship, like the NSS. So we all look forward to hearing our speaker today.
Thank you, sir. The outstanding speaker for today, Mr. Neil Dasaroy, is a deeply rooted man who believes that stellar education should be availed to all. Mr. Neil is currently working with Teach for India, a movement that works towards bridging the educational equity gap. Prior to that, he has worked with Teach for India as a fellow and served for 2 years in government schools and understands what obstructs excellent education to all. He brings with himself a degree in international relations and a keen interest in public policy and governance. We are obliged to have you here, sir. Thank you so much for joining in. Before I ask sir to continue the webinar, I would like to request all of you, in case you have any questions during the webinar, please send them through chat to questions Dimple or questions Tanmay. Thank you. Sir, without much further ado, I would like to request you to start.
Thank you so much, Anushka. And thank you so much, Mr. Raja, for starting us off, right? And I think this one particular statement that you made, that eliminating social evils and the entire crux of it, I think that's also something that I am going to try to focus upon as part of my my inputs pertaining to what I see and what I perceive in the education system moving forward. A little about me. So Anushka rightfully mentioned, I work as a recruitment manager with Teach for India, and I look after the recruitment operations for the colleges in Delhi. So my work is to basically build advocacy for education and invest individuals to come and work as Teach for India fellow. An opportunity that I myself was a part of. I did the fellowship for 2 years, and as part of the fellowship, I taught in a government classroom for 2 whole years, just to understand how the mechanism works at a grassroots level, and also to understand what kind of challenges are and obstacles continue to be an hindrance, to providing excellent education to students around us. But before I go on to that, I'll just share some light about what led me to, joining Teach for India and why education in the first place. So I think I am somebody who has been trying to understand the idea of inequity around us for a long, long time. And I realized that inequity is a huge issue that we are dealing with at every aspects of our life. The other day, I was actually having a conversation with a bunch of students from Hansraj College, Delhi University, and I was telling them that I think the first instance of inequity that I saw was in early childhood at my own place, like at my own home, right? I mean, the way my mother has been treated, or the way I think the whole society works, I think inequity is something that is ingrained in our own personal spaces for us to see how it reflects upon our professional and the public space. And that wasn't the first time I sort of reflected upon inequity a lot. But I think over the period of time, what I started doing was I started interacting a lot with individuals. I went on to pursue this internship with the Delhi Commission for Protection of Child Rights, which is the statutory child rights body under the government of Delhi. And there was the first time I saw that inequity lies deep down into the education system. I will give you an example about that. So under the right to education, I hope you're aware about there are 25% seats reserved for the economically weaker section across private schools. Now, what happens is, again, this is something that is coming out of my own personal experience. A lot of schools don't tend to respect that particular law and provision. I think Delhi government was one of the first governments to have sort of accelerated that in their own individual capacity by bringing a strong monitoring mechanism. And there was this one grievance that I had received while I was interning there. And that was a child got admitted to a very prominent school in Delhi. And in spite of the admission being offered to that child, the school administration was not willing to hand over, the admission to the child, primarily because the child's father came from a very economically marginalized section. And I think that was the first instance I saw inequity at a space like education, because till then I was not exposed to the idea that inequity is something that also deeply reflects upon education system in opportunities like this. And I started exploring more and more. And that's where I'm going to just give you a disclaimer to all of you that a lot of what I'm going to share next for the 40 minutes, I think is coming out of a deep reflection that I have inculcated about my experiences on ground with teachers, with students, and that's what I'm that's what I'm going to share. And I think I still am growing and learning as and when I move forward with new experiences every other day. So my experience there led me to believe that education predominantly is the only catalyst for change. At least that's what I would like to believe. And just echoing what Mr. Raja said, I think education can be the catalyst for eliminating social evils at a larger scale, right? I think that's how I always started perceiving education largely. And that's when the Teach for India fellowship opportunity came in. When the offer came in, I was working at a member of parliament's office as a researcher. I was trying to design election manifestos, creating research briefs, curating policies without even knowing whom the policies are going to impact in the first place. So this was my second realization, inequity in public policy as well, because I believe that policies made and policies being executed has a gap. And sometimes the people who are the consumers of that policy are maybe not in a place to understand what is it that it means for them. And with these two experiences that I had, I decided to join Teach for India. And I taught 4th and 5th grade as part of my fellowship in a government municipal run school in Ahmedabad for 2 years. As part of my fellowship, one of the biggest responsibilities that I had for my students was to provide them excellent education. And as I start deep diving into the reforms in the education system, I have a very simple question for you all. Why do you think we need reforms in the education system? Right? I mean, it's an open-ended question, and it would be great if you people can maybe share your responses over on chat. Why do you think we need reforms in the education system?
Can I say something? Can I answer?
Sure.
Yeah, I believe that our education system is more about just marks and not knowledge. मतलब how जितना मैंने देखा है from not maybe school but my college life,
Yeah,
it's more about getting marks and not gaining knowledge.
absolutely. Thank you so much for starting us off. Having is redundant. I can see a response that education that we are having is redundant. Okay. I hear you, Mustaq. I do. I think one last response before I proceed further. Theoretical knowledge and not practical knowledge. Excellent, Diksha. It's more about memory than intellect. We need this change to grow as a society. That's actually a wonderful answer. Yeah. An education today that determines the society tomorrow. Absolutely, absolutely. Great. So I think I will again root the idea of, why we need reforms in the education system based on two very important reasons, according to me. So the first being, like I mentioned earlier, because it's the largest catalyst for change. The other day, I was just trying to understand that how can education sort of eradicate gender discrimination, right? Or education eradicate poverty, or how education can be a catalyst for climate change, or even to provide adequate health facilities in this country. But as I try to understand that, as I understand that education is something that can be a catalyst for a long-term change, one of the biggest setbacks that we are experiencing right now in the education system is the fact that education is not accessible by all. Or even if education is accessible by all, there are modes and layers of it which is creating hindrances in providing excellent education to the ones who receive or who have the facilities of acquiring education. An interesting statistics, right? So ASER, Annual Status for Education Report, which falls under the Pratham Education, they come up with their annual report every year. And the 2018 ASER report tells us that almost 72% of students who study in grade 5 in India don't know how to read a grade 2 text. Okay, now that's a reality. Okay, and if I just follow it up with an example from my own classroom, when I started teaching my students in 4th grade, out of 36 students whom I taught, 26 of them couldn't read a grade 1 text. 24 students out of the 36 students whom I taught, they couldn't do a simple basic single digit addition or a subtraction, right? So that's the first step. Like, there's a huge gap that we are facing in the education system at an elementary level. So just imagine if this gap continues to increase, there will be a breakdown, and that's the breakdown that we see. Because again, the same year, the statistic tells us in ASER 2018 that 26% of students only make it to college, right? Almost 74% of total students in India, they don't make it to college, right? They don't have the required college education. So I believe majority of us present in this particular group are lucky 26% who have had the privilege to actually have a college education or probably pursuing college education right now. Okay. Now, inequity there as well with regards to probably the options that the students have and the resources that is available to them. And as we continue to understand that more and more, I decided to deep dive into the national education policy. I decided to relate a lot of it to what I saw in my classroom, classroom of my peers who were working across the Teach for India movement. And there are certain aspects that we thought that is very, very important for us to bring reforms in the education system, right? And I'm going to touch upon that little by little. But again, trust me when I say this, a lot of it is ingrained in the idea of inequity, because at the end of the day, it's the inequity which is playing a massive role in the resources and even the opportunities that most of the students have in this country. Let's talk about, let's say, the current situation, right? I mean, in India, the elementary education is something that is not prioritized. And it's really unfortunate because I am somebody who comes from that mindset, at least till I joined Teach for India. I always used to be in this perception and being extremely insensitive about the fact that early childhood education or elementary education is nothing. My mother has been a kindergarten school teacher for 25 years, and I have been insensitive to her profession all this while. But things shifted and changed drastically the moment I started teaching my students, because for the first time I realized how much important it is to have a strong elementary education in this country, especially in a country which has massive dropout rates, especially in a country where the definition of literate is sort of skewed. And especially in a country where we can see a huge inequity by the time students reach college. And as we understand this, the first thing that the National Education Policy has sort of emphasized upon is the early childhood care education, right? They decided to do away with the whole 10+2 concept, and they have decided to come with 5+3+3+4 years of entire academic structure. Again, the feasibility part is something that we can always debate upon, but what is great about is that they have decided to include early childhood care education as a very, very important bracket moving forward. And this kept me wondering, right, to an extent where kindergarten will now be a part of formal education. Anganwadis in government schools will be given priorities like no way it was probably given earlier. And the amount of effort that will go on to build foundational literacy and numeracy in this entire elementary education is going to be really, really strong as we speak. Now, what does this mean, right, for moving forward? I think one of the very important aspects, again, the NEP tries to touch upon, and the whole crux of NEP lies upon this particular segment, is the students should have a complete foundational basics of literacy and numeracy by the time they are in grade 3. So if a student doesn't attend a complete foundations for literacy and numeracy by grade 3, the entire crux of whatever NEP is based upon is going to falter. So the whole idea here is to structure and strengthen the early childhood care education, because at this point of time, it's not. It's not, because a lot of what we are seeing around us is coming down to the fact that it was never prioritized. And I completely understand, as an educator who has been in that space for 2 years, I completely understand why it was not prioritized, but now is the time when we can actually start doing that, right? Another interesting way of how I sort of understood the whole grade to gap, in the current education system. So when I gave an example where almost 26 students from my class couldn't read a grade 1 text, the very first thing that I did as a teacher inside my classroom was I decided to do away with the whole teacher coming inside the classroom and teaching the whole class, right? I stopped doing that. I decided to do away with the whole traditional way of teaching students. What did I start doing? I decided to teach them in groups. I decided to give them differentiated support. I decided to build a more sustainable and a robust structure of peer-to-peer learning at an early stage. I decided to focus more on levels and the gap rather than running after the syllabus completion, right? I think some of you did mention it over on chat as well, that we learn, but we probably may not be aware of what exactly that we are learning all this while. And I think one of the basic things that we tend to miss out upon is we will continue to build upon whatever we has been given to us, but if we don't bridge the gap at an early stage, there will be a complete breakdown. And I have been focusing on that, and I had seen so many of my peers in the Teach for India movement also doing the same thing, where they have decided to do away with the whole traditional form of teaching and getting students to learn what they actually are expected to learn. Just imagine, right? Maybe if Anushka or Shivam, they are at grade 5, but they don't know, and they don't know how to read a grade 1 text. It would be inhuman for me as a teacher to teach them a grade 5 curriculum, because they will not understand that. And I, as a teacher, if I continue to push them to learn, and don't see the tangible outcome out of them, I will criticize them, or I will not have good feelings against them. Something that I experienced as a child when I was a teacher, when my teacher used to get really angry if I did not understand anything, instead of rather exploring whether the gap that I have faced all this while is actually being taken care of or not, right? And I think as children, as students whom I have taught, they are really young. They did not have the way to convey their message that भैया मुझे नहीं पता कि first standard का second standard का क्या पढ़ाया जाता है. How can you expect me to learn from a 5th grade textbook? And I think that's the basic sense of empathy that's missing, right? Empathy and compassion are two very, very important things that is missing in the current education system. And I sort of believe that these aspects go way beyond like a policy. These are ingrained on ground understanding of how policies can be implemented. And I really believe that as educators, as reformers, as also people who are actually trying to be advocate for education movement on ground, we really, really need to be empathetic towards the students, to the ecosystem and the larger stakeholders who are working with us all this while. And as I continue to understand that more and more, I am somebody who has focused a lot on community upliftment as part of my 2 years of my fellowship. So one of the very important things that I used to do is I used to go and visit my parents, the students' houses, just to understand where they come from. Another very important thing that I haven't seen back when I was a student was the fact that parents are the very important stakeholder for a children's life. The fact that parental investment is really, really important as part of the process is so important that sometimes we tend to miss out on that. The fact that my students came from economically marginalized section, I realize it is of so much of importance for me to spend time with the parents to understand what is their perception of education looks like. Most of my parents, they were daily wage laborers. They used to drive auto rickshaws. They used to go work as part-time electricians. They used to probably sit idle. Like I have seen parents who did not do anything and they used to sit idle primarily because they were jobless. And it just led me to believe how much of an impact does parents have or communities have over students' life. An ideal example that I can give you, and I could connect it a lot to my parents' visit, like home visits that I used to do. There was this one time in my classroom, the student's name was Qadirullah, and he is probably one of my favorite students across 2 years of my fellowship. Trust me, we do have our favorite students. As much as we want to ignore it, we always know that there's this one child we really care about. So Qadirullah was an extremely violent child in the classroom. He used to beat students. He used to beat girls. He used to specifically beat girls. That's one thing I had noticed as a pattern in his behavior. He also used to beat animals around him. Like that's something he used to do. And there was a constant trend I used to see in his behavior, right? And what I did was, initially I used to get really angry because I was new in the fellowship. I was just trying to understand what challenges might look like. But somebody suggested me, why don't you go and visit his house? The first time I went to his house, the very first thing that I saw in his house made me realize why Qadirullah behaves like that. His father has had a history of beating women in the family. He used to see that in the family happening, right? As a child, as a 10-year-old boy who is seeing something like that back at home, that's something that he used to bring back inside the classroom. For him, beating a girl was very normal because that's something he saw. Now, as an educator, as a teacher who is there inside the classroom, it would be complete lack of empathy on my part if I sort of scold him for the behavior that he's showing. I need to, but I really need to show him the right way, because unless I don't do that, I'll continue to set precedents for something that has already been happening wrong all this while. And that's something I started doing for all the students I taught. I started spending time more and more to understand how community and parents play a huge role, because that eventually brought me to the brink where I decided to bring value-based education very, very strongly inside my classroom. I realized that textbook education will continue to be a strong catalyst for you to maybe gain knowledge, but what about values? As a society, that's something that we are collectively missing out upon, right? And I think even building values from a grassroots level is very important, and it needs to start from school, from an early age, for them to see that happen over the years, so that they come out to be more accountable citizens. I think that's the vision I always see for the students around me, that they need to be more accountable to each other. Again, something that I see missing around us, right? Um, and and just imagine you trying to bridge the education gap along with trying to bring the elements of values. I always used to just adopt the stories that they used to read from their textbooks and bring elements of values live. It's easy. It's not a mammoth task. All you need to do is you need to bring those values live when you are teaching the students inside the classroom. And that's what I did. Sometimes I wonder, like, if I ever get a chance to even set qualitative rubrics for to check value-based education in this country, how would that look like? Because that's something we really, really need. Again, something that maybe the NEP doesn't touch upon, but I would really emphasis on this particular aspect, that we need to bring more value-based education, right? So that we know accountability, we know collaboration, we know ownership, right? I think these are very important values that students need to bring in from an early stage. And that's something that I continue to emphasize upon as and when I move forward. Now, another important thing that I sort of saw in across my classroom, and again, this is where the inclusive education of the NEP really comes into the picture, is inequity within families, right? And I'm sorry, I'm focusing a lot on how marginalized section socially and economically try to see and perceive education, because I think that's the majority in the country who are probably consumers of the education that we are trying to impart. In a classroom where I have 36 students, I had 18 girls. One of the home visits, I found that the girls in the family were being sent to a government school, whereas the boys in the same family were being sent to private schools, right? Again, inequity within the family with regards to how they perceived education, right? For them, the reason why they were sending the girls to a government school was primarily because they believed that a private school education might be more suitable for boys, and B, they never really wanted to invest a lot on a girl child education. Inequity again at a place where I did not even imagine to come it out. Like I never really thought that this is a response I'll get to hear, or maybe I was not aware of it till the time I had a conversation like that. And that just led me to like wonder, like how has the statistics changed altogether in the last few years? Again, ASA report 2018 tells us that we have seen more girl child enrollment in government schools than in private schools, right? And there might be XYZ reasons. We don't know what the reasons and the factors behind that, but based on my experience for 2 years, I really believe that a lot of parents do come with the perception that they would want to send their boys to a private school, but the girls to a government school. And I don't know how this will look like moving forward, but this is a very wrong perception to set when they are trying to establish a strong public education system in this country. And another very important aspect in general that we are looking into is how we perceive public schools and that of private schools, right? How we see government schools in India and how we see private schools in India. A very simple question to you all. Do you think you will go and study in a government school, right? I mean, this is a question that always a lot of my peers have asked me, that do you think you would want to send your child to a government school? If your answer is yes, amazing. If your answer is no, then I think this is the reason why we are here. We are here because we would really want to understand what is it that is creating a hindrance in the public education system. And it's really sad, because in a country where we have more students studying in government schools, our public education system is sort of lagging behind. And it's not lagging behind because the government is not putting in efforts. Of course, they have their responsibilities, but there are so many other layers and factors which is sort of adding up to how an experience in a government school might look like. My 2 entire years, and I'm sure we have individuals in this call who are more experienced than me and probably can echo the same thoughts. For 2 years, this is one thing I've seen with government school teachers in my schools where I taught. They are swamped with admin work. They're swamped with election duties. Luckily, this year the census work has not started yet owing to the pandemic, but this year the teachers were about to go out for the census responsibility as well. It's like they are made to do a lot of work apart from teaching, right? And again, you can't blame the government. They need man force, right? They need people to do that work. How is it that you're going to balance it out? But as somebody, as a teacher in that school, and I used to see students in other non-Teach for India classroom in the same school, I sort of was under the impression that how will this look like? There was this one instance where in a school of 800 students, and which is managed by almost 20 teachers, all the government teachers were sent to a training, and there were only 3 Teach for India teachers managing 800 students in the school. This is something I've seen with my own eyes happening, right? And I think we really need to build that sense of accountability. And the sense of accountability needs to come from multiple quarters. Everybody has a role to play there. And I think it eventually boils down upon as to how we see responsibilities coming now, right? Now, another very important aspect that I strongly advocate and I strongly am looking forward to is the whole idea of inequity, which has risen because of the pandemic. Um, Back in May, when we were just trying to understand and analyze the data that we had with us, we realized that almost 300 million children have stopped going to schools. Okay. This is primarily because they don't have resources, they don't have access to resources. A lot of them belong to migrant families and they went back to their villages in the middle of the pandemic. So there was no means to reach out to them. We had no idea whether the students are going to come back or not. 300 million children across the country stopped having access to education. Now, this just makes me wonder, um, how will the situation look like once the pandemic gets over with regards to the statistics? Earlier, it was 72% students from grade 5 who couldn't read a grade 2 text. As optimist as I want to be, but I really would want to understand how and whether the 72% might increase drastically in times to come. Second is the dropout rates, right? Because of the pandemic, there's a massive increase in the dropout rates that we are seeing. Again, lack of resources, lack of opportunities. A lot of families, again, because of the migrant issue altogether, a lot of families moving back to their villages have stopped education for their children when they were studying in cities. And I think the most important aspect here that I'm also getting to see as a huge trend is huge enrollment in government schools owing to the pandemic. So a lot of families are actually shifting from private schools to government schools in the middle of the pandemic, primarily because lack of resources, right? They couldn't afford a private school education. And now they are being sent to a government school. Now, the best part is now the onus is upon the government and the stakeholders involved there to actually strengthen the public education system because it's an excellent opportunity for them. But then at the same time, the government school also sort of is in a place where accessibility is a huge concern, is a massive concern that we get to see because students are probably not getting the education there compared to their private school peers. So I'm trying to like compare and contrast and just to understand like how is it that we are going to move forward, because even though schools might open up in the near future, how will that look like? And I think as we continue to explore that, as we continue to understand that, I think I will eventually bring this entire discussion over to the idea of inequity, right? Because the examples that I gave you, the instances that I shared, and whatever inputs I had shared with you, a lot of it, if you understand it, has a deep root cause pertaining to inequity around it, right? And a sense of inequity is something that is continuing to create a massive digital divide. It's continuing to create a huge gender disparity, whether it's in enrollment, whether it's in dropout ratio, or even within, let's say, a government and a private school in this country. It's the inequity which is probably hindering teachers from not taking up adequate responsibilities, right? I think 2 years in a government school made me realize that how empathetic I need to be towards the teacher, because they are not shying away from their responsibilities. They are there. They want to work, but maybe the ecosystem is not strong enough for them to like sort of push it through, while they are in that space for as long as they were. And I think as inequity continues to play a huge role, we will always come back upon the question that how is it that we can strengthen the education system moving forward. And I think the insights that I shared, if we continue to focus on that, in longer run, you will actually get to see it in higher education and college education as well. I mean, a basic understanding like an intersection of disciplines for a strong college education eventually have to come from a school education, where I think our parents need to stop asking us to choose between science, commerce, and arts, and maybe let us rationalize as to what kind of program that we want to choose for ourselves. The fact that excellent education also gives you a potential to like build awareness and actually ask questions and make a right choice for yourself is something that we need to bring from the early stage. And I think that's something that collectively we need to build upon. And I think that's one of the reasons why I decided to join the recruitment team at Teach for India, because I realized that education being a huge problem, the obstacles that we see around us, I realized that there's so many puzzles, right? I mean, if education system is a huge puzzle, we see puzzle pieces which sort of creates an hindrance, or maybe puzzle pieces which can also be a catalyst to build an excellent education system. It can be anything from, being a part of early childhood education, to being part of edtech organization, to working with government at policy and governance level, or to even continue to be a great teacher in schools where you want to teach moving forward. And these obstacles, is something that we will not be able to do it alone. Like, I don't think I can do it alone. I don't think Shivam can do it alone. Neither can Anushka. I realized that a movement in itself can be a catalyst for change. And trust me, this movement goes beyond education as well. It's the fact that we want to bridge inequity, the fact that we want to eliminate social issues. It needs to come from education movement, or a movement at large, and it has to be a collective action. And I think that's what I'm rooting for. That's something that I really, really would want to advocate for, because the more we come together and we build more awareness and we start understanding where the problem lies and start solving it, that's where the change is going to come. Does that mean that you need to come and work in the education system? No, that's not what I am asking you to do. But I strongly believe that if you know there is a problem and you know the root cause of the problem, how much is it that you are putting in effort to sort of change it in your own individual capacity? And the moment we start doing that, we'll start accelerating change the way we could. I've seen my peers do. We have a strong alumni network of 3,400 alumni, and they are advocating for education at the grassroots level. An ideal example that I can give you, the Delhi Commission for Protection of Child Rights, where I interned, the chairperson, Anurag, he is a Teach for India alumnus, and he is holding the chairperson's position without being an IAS officer, right? And he has been doing excellent work. One of his strongest initiative for the Delhi government is that he wants to make Delhi child labor free by 2023, right? And he's focusing on monitoring mechanisms, because again, as we continue to accelerate growth, what are the monitoring mechanisms? Something, again, you all will agree upon that we will continue to have structures, but we need something and somewhat to monitor those structures at the grassroots level, right? And that's an initiative. That's the puzzle piece that he wants to focus upon, and that's what he wants to build upon. And I think that's exactly something that I would also encourage. I would also endorse. Like, do whatever you can from your end, and I think that's exactly how we can accelerate change in longer run, right? I think that's all from my end. I am open to questions. Over to you, Shivam, Anushka, rest of the people. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll start. First question we have is from Vignesh Narayan. Considering Chapter 2, Clause 2 of NEP, which deals with National Book Framework Policy, do you think, sir, it is practically achievable in the Indian education system?
It is. See, again, with regards to that particular aspect, a lot will eventually boil down upon the state governments, right, as to how they would want to contextualize it for their states. Again, that's also one of the biggest flaws, I would say, with NEP. And I think it's understandable that every state government will have their own understanding as to how they would want to do it, but it will eventually come down to the state governments as to how they would want to execute it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Next question we have is from Ishan Chitnis. How can student-directed teaching be implemented at the school level, which could help us drift away from the traditional method of teaching at the initial stages of learning?
That's actually an interesting question, Ishan. I think the fact that in the initial years, when we are trying to set up like a strong fundamental and base for the students, a lot as an educator that goes behind is to just understand the needs of a student, right? I think that's why early childhood care education is also something that I'm assuming the government is trying to prioritize upon. One of the most ideal ways I've seen teachers doing it is, like I mentioned as an example, spending time with the students, understanding their requirement, understanding where their gaps lie. An example would be in a third grade, not every child will be able to understand and read a third grade textbook, but maybe there will be some students who will understand a third grade book and some of them will understand a grade 2 or a grade 1 textbook. Now my support needs to shift drastically based on the student that I am catering to and what kind of support I can provide them. I will not go and teach a third grade textbook or a content from a third grade textbook for somebody who doesn't understand a grade 1 text, right? And that sort of a differentiated learning really needs to be adopted. And I think that's where I think we need to do away with the, I believe, I think again depends upon the context of the classroom. I've seen classrooms where all the students are at the same academic level. So maybe in classes like that, you will be able to focus teaching all the students at the same time. But in a classroom where there's a huge disparity, even in learning levels, I strongly advocate that giving differentiated uh, structures will really help for the students. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
Yeah. So
Next question.
yeah, we have this question on the chat box. Sir, as you spoke about the changes at the micro level, right, on the grassroots level, how can these changes replicated at the national level and bring in collaborative?
Huh? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part of the question.
And yeah, thank you. So, sir, as you spoke about changes at the ground level by sharing your personal experiences, how can these changes be replicated at a national level so that this collaborative change and this disparity which lies between groups does not continue to exist?
Right. I think there are multiple layers of consultations that need to happen at a grassroots level. We need to have a robust structure for sharing teaching practices. We need to have a robust structure of classroom practices, pedagogical changes that we are endorsing. The fact that in an era of globalization, we really need to leverage globalization in a way where teachers can be connected and they can share resources, they can share their ideas, they can put forth their views. Again, the fact that all classroom has their own way of functioning, but the fact that there is so much of diversity within a classroom also overlaps across classroom, right? So if Ishan, you are a teacher, and if I am a teacher, I'll see similar trends coming in your classroom as well and in my classroom as well. Now, how much it is that I can do is I can share practice. That's one reason why the community where I am in right now, we learn and grow along with each other. And we would want to bring that out live in the other communities as well, right? Because the more we multiply and amplify our understanding of what excellent education looks like, only then we will sort of see a large scale impact happening. It is happening. I mean, I know teachers who have proactively taken initiatives to do that. I mean, if you come from a group of schools, I'm sure this is a practice that they do tend to follow. But I think we really need to make it more accessible to teachers who may not have resources like that. And I think this is where the civil society, the government, they all need to pitch in and create some structures around it. But yeah.
Thank you, sir. Next question we have is from Padmavati ma'am. She asks, will the system of rational thinking and analytical skills be developed in today's schools?
I think so. I strongly do. I think the fact that experiential learning eventually gives a lot of emphasis on rationale and analysis for students as well. It is very much possible. I will tell you how is it that I tried doing in my classroom, right? An ideal example that I can give you, and this is where experiential learning is really important. In my class, I had one student who had lost his vision very recently when he joined my class. In a class of 30, am I audible? Yeah. So he was the only child who couldn't see, while the rest of them they ran around, they used to go around the classroom, they used to show a lack of empathy towards the child, because he couldn't see. Now, one of the most interesting thing that I did in that class as an example was I decided to create, I was teaching EVS to my students, and the chapter was on the blind people, like that's what the chapter's name was. So what I decided to do was I decided to give my students an experience of a blind person's life. So I decided to close all the children's eyes with their dupattas. And I told them that let's go out. I'll give you 10 seconds, sorry, a minute to go out and come back, just to make them realize how is it that do they feel to be a blind person, right? What kind of challenges they experience and so on. The fact that they went out, they came back and they had this sense of struggle, and the students themselves realized that, oh yes, this is something that what we were doing was wrong. We were bullying a child because of a disability, and that's not something that we should do. Made me realize that these sort of learnings given to the students will actually give them an ample amount of opportunity to analyze and even have very rational thoughts about their actions. Second, and this is a very important thing, and I really hope educators should do it, is a strong sense of accountability by asking two questions. I always used to tell them, like, every action, before you take that action, think whether this action is right for you or not. B, whether this action is going to hurt somebody or not. Again, a very ingrained two important questions that I have always set for my students. 2 years later, by the time I was completing my fellowship, my students, before every action, they used to have this question that if I do this, whether it will impact somebody or not. B, whether this is going to help me or not, right? Now, these are very important reflection questions that we need to build on in our students, right? And that will eventually lead to them rationalizing everything as they move forward. Imagine a 10-year-old boy doing it inside the classroom and using it as a practice for all their life. By the time they turn 26 of my age, they'll probably be at a place where they're more aware, they're more empathetic, and they're more accountable. And they will think the best for themselves. I think that's equally important. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, sir. Next question we have is from Ren PCGT. Do you think all India education services should be established which will decide the policies of education in consultation with educationalists?
That's actually quite an interesting question. Ideally, yes. But then again, I'm also looking into the feasibility part of it, right? I'm just trying to understand how feasible will that look like. And the fact that even if we don't have such a services, how much is it that we can make it more robust within the current setup that we have, right? For the consultations part, I strongly believe that we really need to have more teacher presentation and student presentation in the policies that we curate. Though NEP, I think when the draft was initially made last year, they did send it out for feedback. They did send it out to stakeholders to give their understanding of what is it that they would want to change. But I think somewhere down the line, I believe as teachers, as somebody who are equal stakeholder in the education system, I believe students are an equal stakeholder in the education system, and that is something that we tend to miss out upon. And as much as we want to curate a structure for the teachers to have their voice in the entire setup, I really want to see a more important structure where students equally have a voice, because at the end of the day, the students are the consumers of the education, the entire system, and whatever they will be taking back from the education, right? Sometimes what we tend to do is we tend to ignore that aspect primarily because of age factor, but I don't think that can be a reason. A great example would be at Teach for India, we have a very strong pilot for student leadership. And in our classroom, students and teachers co-decide what curriculum they would want to set for the classroom. They co-decide what kind of projects they would want to do. And this eventually comes down to children as young as 10 and 11 years old, right? I mean, it's okay. They will have their understanding and their perception of how it looks like. And that's something that we need to encourage. Services of that kind would definitely be great. But at the same time, again, feasibility is a huge concern, and that's something I'm not an expert in. I don't know how will that look like. But as we continue to contemplate on that, I would want people to think about student representation as well, because that's equally important. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We have one more question from Mushtaq. how to cater the learning needs of students in a conflict zone where students feel alienated.
This is something that I also have been thinking about for a long time. I know of a teacher from Teach for India who went to Yemen for a part-time work, and where he taught students there in the refugee community. I know of fellows who have been, trying to help students at the Delhi Right refugee site, right, back in the month of February. And this is something that I've taken back from my conversations with them. I realized that if you are a student at a conflict zone, I think the fact that education in itself is probably the last thing that you will be wondering, right? It's also a matter of survival. It's a matter of what is there in front of you at the same time. And in the middle of all of this, just imagine the emotional trauma that the children are going through at that point of time, and sort of like understand where they are and try to help them and aid them. Um, and I think as educators who are probably working in conflict zones, I strongly believe that they are people who come with a lot of empathy and compassion to start. I strongly believe that they are probably individuals who need to bring empathy first before they even start teaching. Second, I think the need of the hour is to ensure that maybe it's not from an exam perspective, maybe it's not from completing a coursework, maybe it's time to like build basic awareness and probably revolving the entire curriculum around that. And that's what teachers in conflict zone, at least the ones I know of, have tried doing. Their entire idea was to like build awareness, set basic foundational skills, give them values, right? I mean, the fact that a lot of them have lost their lives, a lot of them have gone through personal loss during that entire period, probably is not giving them at a right opportunity, giving them a right opportunity to teach. um, and maybe at this point of time we really need more such teachers moving forward. But I know of an excellent teacher who has done this. He went to Yemen, and he worked with the Malala Foundation for some time teaching students there, and his experience was really great. And I think the kind of resilience that he was telling me, that students come with so much of resilience there, it's something that he took away from them. And I think it's a two-way thing that you get to experience there. So yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. I hope a lot of queries were answered today. Now, I would like Ishan Chitnis to take over.
Yeah, thank you, Dimple. Before we conclude today's session with the vote of thanks, I would like to call over our trustee, Rekha Sahani ma'am, who's present here, to please share a few words. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ishan. Thank you so much. Neil, you took me to my young days. You know, I've been in education, and when you were speaking, it was like a journey. And every word that you said was so touching and so very beautiful. I used to go from door to door talking to the parents of my students. And when you were talking about compassion and when you were talking about empathy and things like that, well, in today's school, we are teaching that. And I just feel, honestly, as a trustee of PCGT and being in education, today we have with us, we are 245 at the moment participants. And I just feel we don't need educators. We really don't need educators. We need these 245 people to go out in the society and make a difference. Because what you said, I've done census duty, I've done election duties and things like that. And the way the youth can reach out to our kids in school, nobody can. Y'all can play, y'all can have fun, y'all can do things with them. And I have worked with children in Syria, in Kashmir, in Pakistan, and Lebanon. And I know what they go through and what the teachers go through. So I think giving y'all exposure to such children, and it has made me more compassionate. It has made me more understanding. You know, it was very easy to tell these youth ki tum log aise kyun karte ho and why, till they actually stayed in my house. And I used to write little notes for them, which some of the interns will tell you I do that all the time. That changed their life, and today when they're back in their country, they are doing so much. So for me, Teach for India is very close to the heart, and your youth are very close to my heart. So I would feel that, you know, if each one of you could even adopt a neighborhood, I think our country is going to be wonderful. And to share one more thing, because you kept on uh, focusing on that, I happen to be the Diplomatic Secretary of Early Childhood Association of India, and Association for Primary Education and Research. So please, anytime, wherever you need me, I'm the chalta firta kind of education on wheels, I feel. For me, I have taken risk. And I think because it's the youth, I would request, if anytime you'll want me to give message to your parents, I'm there for that, because I think parents hold children back. I, as a parent, also think a lot, but I feel we need to let go of our children and give you all the opportunity to explore, express, and do wonderful things. So thank you so much for sharing this. It was wonderful. I didn't know what I was coming to, but I told Shivam and Ishan, I'll be there because education is my passion. Children are my passion. When Raja sir also sent me, I said, of course I'm going to be there. So it was so wonderful listening to you. And I wish you all the best. And everyone who's on this platform, I wish you all the very best. And I think such kind of exposure is the first thing. Let us leave the children to experience it. So come with me to Kashmir, come with me to Pakistan, come with me to areas. And you're so right, because boys used to come to my school and the girls used to go to the BMC school, till I used to go to their homes and brought them to my school. So very happy with what I'm hearing and listening to all of you. So thank you so very much. My much gratitude to each one of you over here. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing those words. It's a privilege to have you here today with us.
Thank you.
Moving ahead, I would like to thank our speaker of the day, Neil sir, for being here. Our trustees, Mr. Raja, Mr. Ribeiro, and Rekha Sahani ma'am, for being present here. To start with, sir, Neil sir, it was really great to listen to your personal experience and how you told us about the things which you did and how you got into education, the aspect of equity. So it was really great to listen to that, and the way you link that to the micro level change which you tried to bring in, during your Teach for India fellowship. It was really great to see that how this change needs to sprout at the micro level, and then we can expect a larger change. At the same time, I believe our main goal here was to indicate how holistic change needs to happen, and that did happen today through this webinar, where you spoke about different aspects which need to come together and bring in this change. So I believe we all can take this from what Neil sir has done, that we all need to do our own bit, and through that we can bring in this collaborative change. I would like to thank Neil sir one more time for being present here. At the same time, I'd like to thank all our viewers and all our organizing committee members. It was a privilege to have you all, and looking forward to see you all in the next webinar. Thank you.